Good evening, gentle listeners. Welcome to another journey through the quiet corridors of history, where we explore tales both enlightening and wonderfully drowsy. Whether you're nestled beneath warm blankets or stealing a peaceful moment from your busy day, I'm delighted you've chosen to spend this time here. Before we begin, I'd love to know where in the world you're listening from tonight. Are you watching the stars appear, or perhaps greeting the dawn? Let me know in the comments below. And if these unhurried explorations through time help you find rest or relaxation, please consider subscribing for more episodes. Tonight, we venture into medieval Europe, a time of towering cathedrals and torchlit castles, of knights and peasants, of rigid hierarchies and unforgiving rules. It was an age of profound contradiction, where beauty and brutality existed side by side, where faith and fear walked hand in hand. And for women, particularly those blessed or cursed with exceptional intelligence, it was a world that offered precious few paths to fulfillment. Life in the Middle Ages held unique challenges for everyone. But for bright and ambitious women, the obstacles were particularly overwhelming. Restrictive customs, inflexible social roles, and a systematic denial of opportunity combined to keep their potential firmly contained. As we wander through this chapter of history, we'll encounter women who dared to imagine lives beyond society's suffocating boundaries. Women who hungered for learning in a world that withheld education. Women who sought to exercise influence in spheres jealously guarded by men. Some managed to carve out remarkable lives against impossible odds. Others met heartbreaking ends, crushed beneath the weight of prejudice and superstition. Their stories, though separated from us by centuries, still echo with familiar themes: the struggle to be recognized, to be valued, to be heard. In celebrating their courage and mourning their losses, we gain deeper appreciation for both the progress we've achieved and the work that remains. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let's begin at the beginning, shall we? Picture, if you will, the Europe of 1,000 years past. A continent slowly emerging from the turmoil that followed the collapse of the Western Roman Empire. The treasures of classical learning, safeguarded by scholars in distant lands and Byzantine libraries, had begun trickling westward again, lighting the first small flames of what would eventually become the Renaissance. But that glorious flowering of art and intellect remained far in the future. For now, envision a land fractured into countless feudal kingdoms and principalities. A rigidly layered society where noble lords governed vast estates cultivated by peasant farmers bound to the soil. The Catholic Church towered above all, its magnificent cathedrals rising higher than even the mightiest fortresses. Its teaching shaped every aspect of existence from cradle to grave, and beyond that, it was a world of stark contrasts: splendor and squalor, devotion and violence, romantic ideals and harsh realities. And for women, it was a world of severely limited possibilities. The ideal woman was obedient, pure, and humble. A helpmate to her husband, a nurturing mother to her children, a faithful servant of God. Straying from this narrowly defined path invited scandal at best, deadly peril at worst thought, of course. Women being the brilliant, complex beings we are, not everyone contentedly accepted a life of domestic servitude and passive submission. Some longed to study and create, to shape events and lead. But the road for women who dared to dream was treacherous indeed. Let's meet one such woman now. A young noblewoman coming of age in 12th century France. Dot imagine her as a girl approaching womanhood. Slender and graceful, with keen gray eyes that seem to absorb every detail of her surroundings. She possesses a quick, inquisitive mind that delights in deciphering Latin phrases from her father's books and posing theological questions to the family chaplain. As the daughter of a minor baron, she's received slightly more education than most girls of her era. She can read a little, write her name, recite her prayers. But it's nowhere near enough to satisfy her hungry intellect. She yearns to immerse herself in great works of philosophy, to debate learned scholars, to unravel the mysteries of the natural world. Alas, such pursuits are forbidden to young ladies. Her father indulges her precocious intelligence to a point. After all, a cultured, witty bride attracts a better class of husband. But he also recognizes the danger in allowing her mind too much freedom. An overeducated wife, he knows, breeds discord and scandal. Better to curtail her studies before they lead her into trouble. And so on her 14th birthday, instead of the precious illuminated manuscript she's been coveting, her father presents her with a betrothal contract. She's to wed the eldest son of a neighboring count, joining 2 noble houses and their estates. Her future is sealed in ink and wax, a life of managing a household and bearing heirs stretching before her like a sentence. She wants to protest, to rage against the injustice. Why should her brothers be sent to university, trained as knights and clerics and statesmen, while she's bartered away like property? Why should her worth be measured only in her dowry and her fertility? But she knows such outbursts will change nothing. Her path has been determined by forces far beyond her control. As she stands at the altar draped in the finest silks and brocades, she feels something within her shrivel. The bright-eyed girl who dreamed of a life of learning is packed away like a childish toy, replaced by a young woman who must navigate the real challenges and constraints of her new role. She will fulfill her duty, manage her household with skill and grace, bear strong sons to carry on the family name. But a piece of her will always grieve the loss of the brilliant, boundless future that was never truly hers to claim. Our noble woman's story was tragically common in the Middle Ages. For the vast majority of women, even those of high birth, opportunities to cultivate their minds were vanishingly rare. Convents offered a glimmer of hope. Within their cloistered walls, nuns enjoyed access to libraries and writing rooms, time to study away from the demands of marriage and motherhood. Some noble women, especially widows who could control their own properties, also managed to create spaces for intellectual growth. But these were the fortunate few. Most women, high-born and low, were completely excluded from formal learning. Literacy rates were dismally low, with perhaps only 1 woman in 10 able to read, and even fewer able to write. Girls might be taught enough to recite prayers and manage basic household accounts, but serious study in fields like theology, law, medicine, or natural philosophy, unthinkable. It wasn't merely lack of access holding women back. It was a pervasive belief in their intellectual inferiority. The writings of classical philosophers like Aristotle and early church fathers like Augustine portrayed women as irrational, emotionally unstable creatures, inherently less capable of reason and virtue than men. These ideas, filtered through medieval Christian doctrine, created a culture that viewed educating women as not only unnecessary, but potentially dangerous. An educated woman, after all, might begin questioning her ordained place in the world. She might chafe at the limitations imposed on her, the assumptions of her weakness and subservience. She might, heaven forbid, start getting ideas above her station. In a society dependent on everyone knowing and accepting their role in the great chain of being. A woman who sought to break out of her designated sphere was seen as more than an aberration. She was a threat to civilization's very fabric, and so for an intelligent young woman with dreams of something more, the message was clear: forget your foolish fantasies of education and independence. Learn to be satisfied with a life in the shadows, in service to your father, your husband, your sons. It's simply the natural order, ordained by nature and by God. But of course, human nature being what it is, not every woman contentedly accepted this bleak fate. Scattered through the historical record, we find tantalizing glimpses of women who managed, against all odds, to leave their mark on the medieval world through wit, determination, and sheer audacity. One such woman was the formidable Beatrice of Provence, queen consort of both France and England over her long and tumultuous life. Born in the year 1128 to one of the wealthiest and most powerful noble families in Europe, Beatrice was renowned from youth for her beauty, vivacity, and razor-sharp intellect. Highly educated by the standards of her day, she could read and write in Latin as well as her native Occitan dialect. She was a skilled diplomat with a keen grasp of politics and intrigue. At 15, Beatrice married the future King Philip VII of France, beginning a royal career marked by both splendor and strife. She accompanied her husband on the Second Crusade to the Holy Land, an unprecedented act for a woman, leading her own contingent of knights and ladies through treacherous foreign lands. But the marriage itself was troubled. Philip was a devout and stolid man, ill-matched to Beatrice's mercurial brilliance. After 15 years and no sons, the union was annulled. Undaunted, Beatrice swiftly secured an even more advantageous match, wedding Henry de Montfort, Duke of Normandy and heir to the English throne. Their tempestuous marriage produced 8 children, including 2 future kings, and presided over a vast empire stretching from the Scottish borders to the Pyrenees. Beatrice was no mere consort. She was a force to be reckoned with, a savvy political operator who wielded immense influence in both the French and English courts. But her power and prestige came at a price. Her marital disputes with Henry were legendary, fueled by his flagrant infidelities and her own headstrong nature. When their sons rebelled against Henry in the year 1173, Beatrice was accused of supporting the uprising and placed under house arrest. She would spend the next 16 years as a prisoner, moved from castle to castle at Henry's whim, her freedom and authority stripped away. Lesser women might have broken under such treatment, retreating into passivity and despair. But Beatrice endured, drawing on reserves of resilience and cunning that had served her well throughout her extraordinary life. When Henry died in 1189, she re-emerged as a power in her own right, serving as regent for her son Richard the Lionheart. While he was away on the Third Crusade, she navigated the treacherous waters of international diplomacy, brokering alliances and treaties, using her formidable intellect and political acumen to secure her family's position. Beatrice's story testifies to the indomitable spirit of brilliant women facing incredible adversity. In a time when women were seen as little more than property to be traded and controlled, she managed to carve out space for herself. As a true player on the world stage, she was not immune to the strictures and perils faced by all women of her time. Indeed, she spent nearly 2 decades as a political prisoner, her agency stripped away by an angry husband. But she also demonstrated the heights a woman of intelligence and determination could reach, even in the most hostile circumstances. Of course, Beatrice was in many ways an exception, her lofty status providing opportunities denied to most of her sex. For women further down the social ladder, the consequences of asserting their intelligence and autonomy could be dire indeed. The tale of one such woman, a clever peasant wife in 14th century England, illustrates the brutality that could be brought to bear on women who dared to question their place. Life for a medieval peasant was harsh and unrelenting, a constant struggle against hunger, disease, and backbreaking labor. For women, the burden was even heavier. In addition to working the fields alongside their husbands, they were responsible for all domestic duties: cooking, cleaning, spinning, weaving, brewing, tending to children and animals. A wife was expected to be her husband's helpmate and servant, deferring to his authority in all things. Our peasant woman was no stranger to hard work and hardship. From the time she could walk, she'd been put to work, first caring for younger siblings, then helping her mother with the endless round of household chores. At 14, She was married off to a boy from the neighboring village, trading one life of drudgery for another. But despite the grinding poverty and ceaseless toil, she possessed a lively mind and independent spirit. She had a way with herbs and poultices, a knack for coaxing ailing livestock back to health. The other village women sought her advice on everything from settling colicky babies to getting stubborn bread to rise. Her clever hands could weave the most intricate patterns. Her nimble fingers plaited the finest straw hats. Her husband, Thomas, a stolid and unimaginative man, didn't quite know what to make of his quick-witted wife. He was proud of her skills, the extra pennies her handiwork brought in. But he was also wary of her sharp tongue, the way she sometimes questioned his decisions or offered her own ideas. It wasn't fitting, he thought, for a woman to be so bold. Matters came to a head one autumn when the rains were late and the harvest looked to be poor. Thomas decreed they would slaughter their pig and salt the meat to ensure food supplies for winter. But his wife disagreed. The pig, she argued, was their one valuable asset. If they could keep it alive, it would farrow in spring, giving them a litter of piglets to sell. They could weather a lean season, she insisted, but losing the pig would impoverish them for years. Thomas was furious at being challenged so openly, in front of the other village men, no less. It was his prerogative as head of household to make such decisions, and his wife's duty to obey. Enraged and humiliated, he dragged her home and beat her viciously, determined to break her willful spirit and reassert his authority. The woman endured her husband's abuse in agonized silence, knowing any outcry would only bring more trouble. In the close-knit world of the medieval village, a wife who defied her husband was seen as a disruptive and dangerous force, a threat to the God-given order of things. Best to suffer quietly, to swallow her pain and pride, to submit as a good wife should. But something in her broke along with her bones. The light in her eyes, the quick wit and daring that had sustained her through so many trials, seemed to gutter and fade. She went through the motions of her days, tending to her work with grim efficiency. But the spark that had made her exceptional was gone, ground out by the unyielding pressure to conform. It's a story that played out countless times in the Middle Ages, with variations across class and circumstance. For peasant women, the demands of sheer survival left little room for intellectual or creative fulfillment. Their worth was measured in their ability to labor and breed, to serve their husbands and lords. Any deviation from that script, any hint of a woman overstepping her bounds, was met with swift and often brutal suppression. Even women who managed to secure a measure of learning or influence weren't safe from the ever-present threat of violence and subjugation. Theirs was a precarious position, always at the mercy of the men who held power over them. A woman seen as too intelligent, too independent, too threatening to the status quo could easily find herself on the receiving end of some of the Middle Ages' most fearsome tools of control. And none were more terrible than the accusation of witchcraft. In the medieval mind, a woman's intellect was a dangerous thing. A woman who knew too much, who exercised too much power, who refused to conform to her prescribed role, was suspect. And in a world steeped in superstition, where any misfortune from a failed harvest to a sickly child could be attributed to malevolent magic, a suspect woman could easily find herself branded a witch. The image of the witch in the Middle Ages was a conflation of various folk traditions, pagan remnants, and Christian anxieties about the diabolical. Witches were believed to be in league with the devil, wielding unholy powers to curse their neighbors, blight crops, and corrupt the faithful. They were depicted as the inverse of the ideal medieval woman, unruly, unchaste, uncontrolled, a threat to the divinely ordained order of society. Of course, the reality was far more mundane and tragic. Most women accused of witchcraft were not powerful sorceresses, but rather society's most vulnerable members, widows, beggars, outcasts, anyone who didn't fit neatly into the prescribed social order. Women who practiced traditional healing or midwifery were particularly at risk. Their knowledge of herbs and bodily functions easily twisted into something sinister. Such was the case of Agnes Porter, a French mystic and writer who ran afoul of the Inquisition in the early 14th century. A Beguine, a member of a lay religious community of women, Agnes was a learned and articulate theologian, author of a complex spiritual treatise called The Mirror of Pure Souls. In it, she described a path to divine union that bypassed the church hierarchy, a radical notion in a time when the church jealously guarded its role as intermediary between God and the faithful. And as his ideas, her claim to direct spiritual authority, made her a threat in the eyes of the religious establishment. She was tried for heresy by the Inquisition. Her book condemned as full of errors and heresies. She was given a chance to recant, to submit to the church's authority and disavow her teachings. But Agnes refused, insisting on the truth of her spiritual insights. Her defiance sealed her fate. In 1310, Agnes was burned at the stake in Paris, her ashes scattered to prevent her becoming a martyr's relic. Her brilliant mind, her years of study and contemplation, her profound spiritual insights, all reduced to smoke and ash because she dared to think for herself. The fate of women like Agnes serves as a chilling reminder of the price paid by those who dared to step outside prescribed boundaries. In a world that demanded female submission and silence, a woman who spoke with authority, who claimed knowledge and power, invited not just disapproval but destruction. As we've seen, the extraordinary women who did manage to make their mark in medieval times had to overcome immense obstacles. Despite the oppressive attitudes and institutions that held sway, a few remarkable individuals still found ways to develop their intellects and impact the world around them. One such woman was Isabella of France, a 12th century poet who wrote in the Anglo-Norman language. Little is known for certain about her life, but it's believed she was born into French nobility and later lived in England. What is clear is that she was extraordinarily well educated for a woman of her time, fluent not just in her native tongue but in Latin and English, as well. In an era when most poetry was composed by men and focused on male exploits like battles and quests, Isabella turned her perceptive eye to the inner lives of women. Her works, including a series of narrative poems called The Lays, explore themes of courtly love, desire, heartbreak, and the constraints placed on women by society's expectations. Through vivid characters, like the clever queen who tricks her aging husband into granting her freedom to take a younger lover, Isabella gave voice to the unspoken frustrations and yearnings of women trapped in unhappy marriages and restricted roles. Her empathy for her heroines and insight into human nature still resonate with readers today. Imagine Isabella as a young woman, her agile mind absorbing the learning available through her noble family's resources. Perhaps she found a kindred spirit in an open-minded tutor or sympathetic abbess who nurtured her gift for language and storytelling. Even so, she must have faced constant reminders that as a woman, her brilliance would always be constrained. Picture her sitting by a window, quill in hand, parchment spread before her. She gazes out at a walled garden, the beauty of roses and shimmering fountains belying the narrowness of a world that hems women in on all sides. In the poems flowing from her pen, Isabella gives the women of her imagination a taste of the freedom and fulfillment so often denied to her and her contemporaries in real life, writing in a vernacular language rather than the male-dominated Latin. Isabella made her work accessible to female readers who were shut out from most literature. Knowing her audience faced the same suffocating limitations she did, she offered them stories that acknowledged their struggles and affirmed that their desires and dreams mattered. In her Lay of Lanville, Isabella describes a knight who's an outsider at King Arthur's court, neglected and misunderstood. When a beautiful fairy queen falls in love with him, she gives him all he longs for on the condition that he keep their bond secret. Lanville breaks his promise when he confides in Queen Guinevere after she attempts to seduce him, and is harshly punished until his fairy lover appears to save him and take him away to her mystical island. While Lanville is a man, his experience of being stifled, overlooked, and having to hide his true self would have resonated with many medieval women. Isabella slips a subtle critique of her society's injustices between the lines of a romantic adventure. Her fairy queen embodies the power, independence, and loyalty women were so rarely allowed to experience themselves. Despite her talents, Isabella of France remains elusive to us today, a shadowy figure we strain to glimpse through the mists of time. No contemporary images of her survive, and only a few scant details of her life can be guessed at. Like so many brilliant women of her age, she faded into obscurity, leaving behind only a faint echo of her voice in the exquisite poems that bear her name. But what a voice it is! By turns playful, melancholy, sensual, and wise. In The Lay of the Honeysuckle, Isabella recounts the legendary love story of Tristan and Isolde, but from Isolde's perspective, rather than focusing on the male hero as was typical. Her Isolde is no passive damsel, but a complex woman who actively chooses love over duty. Though it means risking everything. It's tempting to imagine that Isabella poured some of her own longing for agency into Isolde's character. Constricted by circumstances she couldn't control, did she dream of a love so powerful it could break through all boundaries? Or did she make her own bold bid for self-determination by daring to write, by insisting that women's stories were worth telling? We can only speculate, but it's a testament to Isabella's genius that her creations continue to spark our imagination and stir our hearts 9 centuries later. Through her luminous poetry, she has achieved a kind of immortality, transcending the limits placed on her in life to speak to us still. Hers is just one example of a brilliant female mind that found a way to shine despite the shadows of prejudice and oppression. But for every Isabella of France whose name is still remembered, there must have been countless more whose lights were snuffed out before they could even begin to blaze. The tragedy is that we'll never know what astonishing works of art, scientific breakthroughs, or visionary ideas the world was robbed of by the systematic suppression of female intellect in the Middle Ages. How many women with the potential to change history were forced into silence, their gifts withering on the vine? It's a sobering thought, but one that makes the defiant achievements of women like Isabella of France all the more remarkable. Against all odds, they found ways to learn, to create, to make their voices heard. They left us a precious legacy, a reminder of the resilience and unstoppable power of the human spirit. So as we drift towards sleep, let's hold a place in our hearts for the brilliant medieval women whose stories have been lost to time. May their forgotten struggles and triumphs light a flame of inspiration in us, a call to nurture the gifts and dreams of every girl and woman fighting to make her mark on a world that's still far from equal. Their voices echo forward, a reminder that progress is hard-won but always possible. And in our own small way, each of us can be part of expanding the possibilities for the next generation. By honoring the powerful whispers of the past, we pave the way for a future where every light has a chance to shine. As we reflect on the extraordinary accomplishments of rare medieval women like Matilda of Rhineland and Catherine de Lion, it's worth pausing to consider the broader context of their lives. These brilliant visionary women were remarkable exceptions in a world that systematically suppressed female intellect. Their stories stand out all the more vividly against the backdrop of the immense challenges intelligent women faced in the Middle Ages. Imagine for a moment the thousands upon thousands of clever girls and women whose talents were left to wither. Picture the young peasant girl with a quick mind and curiosity about the natural world. She longs to learn, to explore, to discover. But instead, from a tender age, she's put to work. Cooking, cleaning, hauling water, tending to younger siblings. There is no time for learning, no opportunity to nurture her intellect. Her cleverness becomes a burden, a restless energy with no outlet. Or consider the merchant's daughter, able to read and write with a keen head for numbers. She could be a brilliant accountant, a shrewd businesswoman, but her fate is sealed by her gender. She will be married off, her skills confined to running a household. Her sharp mind is dulled by the endless repetition of domestic tasks. And then there are the whispered tragedies, the women whose intelligence became their undoing. In a society that prized female obedience and conformity, a woman who dared to question, to challenge, to think for herself could quickly find herself in peril. An accusation of witchcraft, a charge of heresy, could be a death sentence. The very qualities that might have made her an intellectual leader in another time and place her insight, her independence of thought, her boldness, become the instruments of her destruction. It's a grim tapestry, this portrait of stifled potential and silenced voices. But it's essential to acknowledge this history, to recognize the scale of the loss. For every Matilda or Catherine who managed against all odds to let her light shine, there were countless others snuffed out before they could even begin to gleam. And yet, even in the face of such oppression, the human spirit proved irrepressible. In quiet corners and hidden spaces, women found ways to nurture their minds and spirits. In the writing rooms of convents, nuns preserved and copied texts, maintaining a flickering flame of learning. In the kitchens and still rooms of great houses, women brewed herbal remedies and passed down ancient wisdom. And in the privacy of their own thoughts, countless women dreamed and wondered and kept alive the spark of curiosity that is the hallmark of all great minds. As we look back on this complex legacy, it's tempting to feel despair at all that was lost, all the brilliance that was squandered. But we can also feel awe at the resilience, the tenacity, the sheer determination of the women who, against all odds, found ways to let their intelligence shine. Their stories serve as a reminder that the human thirst for knowledge, for understanding, for growth, can never be fully extinguished. That even in the darkest times, the most oppressive circumstances, the light of the mind finds a way to break through. And as we trace the long, slow journey from those medieval constraints to the expanded opportunities of the modern age, we can draw inspiration from those pioneers, from the women who dared to think, to question, to challenge even when the consequences could be dire. They laid the groundwork, brick by painstaking brick, for the edifice of women's education and empowerment that we continue to build today. So let us honor their legacy, not just with words, but with actions. By nurturing the minds of girls and women around the world. By creating spaces where their intellect can flourish, their curiosity can roam free. By challenging the lingering echoes of those old oppressions wherever we find them. In doing so, we pay tribute to the brilliant women of the past who were denied their chance to fully shine. We carry forward their torch, ensuring that their struggles, their sacrifices, their indomitable spirits were not in vain. And we build a future where no clever mind will ever again be left to languish in darkness, where the light of intelligence, regardless of gender, will be free to illuminate our world. As we come to the end of our journey through this shadowed chapter of history, let us carry with us a renewed appreciation for the hard-won progress we enjoy today. And let us resolve to honor the memory of those brilliant, suppressed women of the past by working towards a world where every mind, male or female, is free to reach its full potential. In that spirit, let us end our story here in the quiet of the night. May the tales of these remarkable women, both the celebrated and the forgotten, weave through your dreams. May they inspire you as they have inspired countless. others to nurture your own intellect, and to champion the minds of others. And may we all work together to build a world where the phrase, intelligent woman, is no longer a rarity to be remarked upon, but a glorious commonplace, a shining thread woven through the grand tapestry of human achievement. Thank you for joining me on this journey into the complex, often tragic, always fascinating history of intelligent women in the Middle Ages. May your dreams be filled with visions of a brighter future, where brilliance knows no bounds of gender and where every mind is free to soar. Good night, and sweet dreams. As the seasons turned in medieval Europe, the rhythm of life followed patterns unchanged for generations. The warm months brought endless labor in the fields. The cold months brought huddling near fires and praying the stored grain would last until spring. For women of all stations, each day unfolded with its own particular demands and constraints, its own small rebellions and quiet submissions. Let us linger for a moment in the daily life of these women, to better understand the texture of their existence, the weight of their burdens, the flickers of joy they managed to kindle in the darkness. In the great manor houses, noble women rose with the dawn, their chambers still dim and chilly, despite the tapestries hung to keep out drafts. A lady's day began with prayers in her private chapel, her voice joining with those of her ladies-in-waiting in Latin verses she may or may not have fully understood. The words were familiar, comforting in their repetition, a ritual that connected her to generations of women who had knelt in similar chambers, whispered similar prayers. After morning devotions came the breaking of the fast, a simple meal of bread and ale taken in the solar, the private family quarters away from the bustle of the great hall. Then the real work of the day began. Managing a noble household was no small undertaking. It required keeping careful accounts of stores and supplies, overseeing a small army of servants, planning elaborate meals for the Lord's table, ensuring the smooth running of everything from the laundry to the dairy to the bakehouse. A clever noblewoman could exercise considerable authority within this domestic sphere. She might negotiate with merchants, settle disputes among servants, make decisions about when to slaughter livestock or when to begin preserving fruits. Her judgment was respected, even relied upon, as long as it remained within proper bounds. But there were lines she dared not cross. The larger decisions about the estate, about which crops to plant or which tenants to evict, belonged to her husband. The world beyond the manor walls, the world of politics and commerce and law, was firmly close to her. She might whisper advice to her lord in the privacy of their bedchamber, might subtly influence his thinking through carefully chosen words. But in public, she must always defer to his authority, must never challenge his decisions openly. For some women, this division felt natural, even comfortable. They took pride in their domestic accomplishments, in the smooth running of their households, in the beautiful embroidery that adorned altar cloths and aristocratic garments. They found fulfillment in bearing and raising children, in teaching daughters the arts of household management and courtly behavior. But for others, women of restless intellect and ambitious spirit, the constraints chafed like ill-fitting garments. They saw their brothers ride off to university, to court, to war, while they remained behind, their world bounded by garden walls and solar windows. They felt the stirrings of ideas and questions they had no outlet to express, no audience willing to listen. These were the women who lingered in their fathers' libraries when they should have been at their needlework, who peppered visiting scholars with questions until their families grew embarrassed, who composed secret verses by candlelight and then burned them for fear of discovery. They lived divided lives, their outward conformity masking an inner world of vibrant thought and stifled longing in the villages that dotted the countryside. Peasant women's lives followed different rhythms but were no less constrained. The peasant woman woke even earlier than her noble counterpart, rising in darkness to tend the fire, to prepare the simple porridge that would sustain her family through the morning's labor. by the time the sun crept above the horizon. She was already at work in the fields alongside her husband and children, bent double in the endless task of weeding, planting, harvesting. Her hands grew rough and calloused. Her back ached from the constant stooping. Her face weathered from sun and wind. When the fieldwork paused at midday, there was no rest. She hurried back to her cottage to prepare the main meal, to tend the vegetable garden that supplemented their meager diet, to check on the chickens and the pig that represented their small store of wealth. In the afternoon, there might be brewing to oversee, for ale was the staple drink when water was often unsafe. There might be wool to card and spin, an endless task that occupied her hands, even when she finally sat by the fire in the evening. And yet, within this world of grinding labor, there were spaces where a clever woman could exercise her gifts. The village-wise woman, the one who knew which herbs could ease a fever and which could bring on delayed monthly courses, held a position of respect and even power. Women gathered at the village well to exchange news and gossip, creating networks of information and mutual aid that existed beneath the notice of their menfolk. A woman with a gift for storytelling might hold children spellbound on winter evenings with tales of fairies and heroes, keeping alive oral traditions that stretched back beyond memory. A woman with a talent for brewing might produce ale so superior that it commanded better prices, providing crucial extra income for her family. A woman with nimble fingers might weave or embroider pieces of such beauty that merchants sought them out, giving her a taste of economic independence. But these small victories were always precarious, always subject to male approval or disapproval. A husband who felt threatened by his wife's skills or reputation could easily curtail them. A village priest who frowned upon women gathering and talking among themselves could brand their meetings as occasions of sin. And always, there lurked the danger that a woman who knew too much, who stood out too boldly, might find herself accused of trafficking with dark powers. The change of seasons brought their own particular challenges and occasional joys. Spring meant desperate hunger as winter stores ran low, but also hope as green shoots appeared in the fields and gardens. Summer meant back-breaking labor, but also longer days and warmer nights. Village festivals and holy days that broke the monotony of toil. Autumn meant the urgency of harvest, the race to gather and store before frost and rain destroyed the crops. It meant the bittersweet knowledge that some animals must be slaughtered because there was not enough fodder to sustain them through winter. Women supervised the salting and smoking of meat, the careful preservation of every scrap of food that might mean the difference between survival and starvation in the lean months ahead. Winter brought its own harsh beauty. The fields lay frozen and silent. The work outdoors reduced to the essential tasks of tending livestock and hauling water and firewood. Families huddled together in their cottages, the darkness broken only by the glow of the hearth. This was the season of storytelling, of mending and spinning by firelight, of long nights that seemed to stretch endlessly. For women, winter could be a time of particular hardship. Childbirth in the cold months was especially dangerous, with infection and fever claiming many young mothers. The close quarters meant diseases spread rapidly through households, and the forced idleness could breed tensions, quarrels that erupted into violence when men took out their frustrations on wives and children. Yet winter also brought holy days that punctuated the darkness with celebration. The 12 days of Christmas, when even the poorest households tried to provide special foods and small gifts. Candlemas in February, when women brought their candles to be blessed, a ritual that acknowledged their role as keepers of the hearth and light. These festivals provided rare moments of communal joy, of feeling part of something larger than the narrow confines of daily survival. The church loomed over all of life in medieval Europe, its teachings shaping every aspect of existence. For women, the church's message was decidedly mixed. On one hand, Christianity taught that all souls were equal before God, that women as well as men could achieve salvation. The Virgin Mary was held up as the pinnacle of feminine virtue, the Queen of Heaven whose intercession could move the heart of God Himself. On the other hand, the Church Fathers taught that women were inherently weaker than men, more prone to sin, more easily led astray. Eve's transgression in the Garden of Eden cast a long shadow, a reminder that female disobedience had brought suffering into the world. Women's bodies were seen as dangerous, potential sources of temptation that could lead righteous men astray. This paradox created a particularly difficult path for intelligent, spiritually inclined women. A woman who felt a genuine religious calling had few options. She might enter a convent if her family could provide the necessary dowry. Within common walls, she might find opportunities for learning and contemplation denied to her secular sisters. She might have access to books, time for study, the companionship of other educated women. Some convents became true centers of learning, where nuns copied manuscripts, composed music, studied theology and natural philosophy. The greatest of these institutions produced women of remarkable achievement, scholars and mystics whose works influenced the wider church. But convent life was not without its constraints. Male church authorities maintained ultimate control over even the most independent-minded religious communities. An abbess might govern her nuns with considerable autonomy, but she answered to bishops and archbishops who could overrule her decisions or disband her community entirely. And the vow of obedience that all nuns took could be interpreted in ways that stifled rather than liberated. Moreover, not every woman with religious inclinations had the temperament for cloistered life. Some felt called to live in the world, to serve God through acts of charity and mercy rather than through contemplative prayer. For these women, the options were even more limited. They might join one of the semi-religious communities known as beguinages, where women lived together in voluntary poverty and chastity, while remaining technically part of the secular world. These communities offered a middle path, a way for women to live religious lives without taking permanent vows. But they also attracted suspicion from church authorities who mistrusted any form of female religious expression that wasn't under direct male supervision. Beguines were periodically accused of heresy, their communities disbanded, their members scattered, or worse, died. The great religious controversies of the medieval period often centered on questions of authority and interpretation. Who had the right to speak about divine matters? Who could claim direct knowledge of God's will? For male scholars and clerics, these were difficult but navigable questions. For women, they were fraught with danger. A woman who claimed to have received visions or revelations walked a razor's edge. If her visions reinforced existing church teachings and were endorsed by male authorities, she might be celebrated as a holy woman, even a saint. But if her visions challenged church doctrine or suggested that she had special access to divine truth independent of clerical mediation, she could quickly find herself accused of heresy or demonic possession. The line between acceptable female spirituality and dangerous presumption was always shifting, always subject to the interpretation of men in power. A woman might spend years building a reputation for holiness, only to see it collapse when the political winds shifted or when she crossed an influential enemy. This uncertainty cast a shadow over even the most sincere religious aspirations. Women learned to couch their insights in language of humility and submission, to credit any wisdom they possessed to divine grace rather than their own intellect. They learned the art of strategic self-effacement, of making themselves small enough to be tolerated, quiet enough not to threaten. And yet, despite all these obstacles, despite the constant pressure to conform and submit, women continued to think, to question, to seek understanding. In monastery libraries and manor house solars, in village cottages and merchant counting houses, Women nurtured the life of the mind as best they could. They passed knowledge from mother to daughter in whispered conversations, preserved it in recipes and remedies and folk songs. They created beauty in illuminated manuscripts and embroidered vestments. In the songs they sang while working, in the stories they told their children. They found ways to exercise authority in the domestic sphere, to make their voices heard in family councils, to influence the men who nominally held all the power. These were small victories, easily overlooked by those who wrote the official histories. But they were victories nonetheless, testament to the irrepressible human need for growth and self-expression. They were the cracks in the wall of oppression, the fissures through which future generations would eventually break through. The wider freedom dawned as night falls across the medieval landscape. Imagine all these women settling into their beds, the noble lady in her curtained chamber, the peasant wife on her straw mattress, the nun in her narrow cell, the merchant's widow in her comfortable townhouse. Each carries within her the accumulated wisdom and sorrow of her particular life, her particular struggles. Some fall asleep with prayers on their lips, seeking comfort and faith. Others replay the day's events, worrying over problems to be solved tomorrow. Still others allow their minds to wander into realms of imagination and possibility, dreaming of lives they can never live, freedoms they can never taste. And in the darkness, in that liminal space between waking and sleeping, perhaps the boundaries that constrain them in daylight grow a little thinner. Perhaps in dreams at least they can be anything they choose, scholars and warriors, queens and prophets, women whose brilliance is celebrated rather than feared.